there is a belief, quiet and persistent, that medieval executions were simple acts, that a man or woman condemned to die simply waited and then died, that the machinery of death in the medieval world was brutal and unthinking, a blunt event without ceremony, without ritual, without the long, slow wait of a night that stretched between sentencing and the scaffold. This belief is wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic sense, not wrong in a way that invites gasps or revision, wrong in the way that most simplified beliefs about the past are wrong, quietly, deeply, and ways that reveal far more about human nature than any sensational account could manage. The night before a medieval execution was one of the most choreographed nights in the entire calendar of institutional life. It was a night that involved priests and guards, cooks and wardens, candle makers and bell ringers, confessors and scribes. It was a night that followed rules. It obeyed custom. It moved through stages with a kind of terrible slowness that no modern account fully captures, because modern accounts tend to leap over the hours between the verdict and the moment of death, as though those hours were blank, as though the condemned simply ceased to exist between the courtroom and the gallows. They did not cease to exist. They lived those hours in extraordinary detail, and the people around them lived those hours too, each of them performing roles that had been inherited across generations, roles that had been refined by practice and shaped by theology and adjusted by local custom. Until the night before, a death became, in its own strange way, a highly organised social event. To understand what really happened in those hours, you have to begin not with the condemned, but with the institution that held them. You have to begin with the prison itself, because medieval prisons were not what we imagined them to be, and because the conditions of imprisonment shaped everything that followed. The word prison comes from the old French word meaning to take, to seize. For much of the medieval period, what we would call a prison was not a purpose-built facility designed for long-term incarceration. It was a place of waiting. People were held in custody while they awaited trial, or while they awaited the execution of a sentence already passed. The idea of imprisonment as a punishment in itself, the idea that a person should spend years confined as a consequence of their crime, was not a dominant feature of medieval justice. Medieval justice was more immediate. You were tried and you were punished, and the punishment was physical. A fine, a flogging, a branding, a mutilation, a death, or you were released. The prison was the antechamber, not the room itself. This means that in most cases the period between sentencing and execution was short. Not always. There were exceptions. High-profile cases, cases involving appeals to higher authority, cases where the condemned had powerful friends or family who argued for clemency, could stretch across weeks or months. But for ordinary condemned people, for thieves and murderers and counterfeiters, and those convicted of crimes against the peace of the realm, the wait was often a matter of days, sometimes only a single day and a single night. That night was governed by a logic that was simultaneously religious and practical. Religious because the medieval world understood death as a transition, a passage from one mode of existence into another, and because that transition required preparation. The soul needed to be made ready. The condemned person needed to confess their sins, receive absolution, make peace with God and with the church, so that whatever happened to their body the following morning, their soul might be in a state of grace. Practical because the execution itself was a public act, a civic ceremony, and it required preparation of its own. not just the physical preparations of the scaffold and the executioner, but the social and administrative preparations that surrounded a sanctioned killing. The night began, in most documented cases, with the arrival of the confessor. This was almost always a priest or friar, often from a religious order that had taken on a special ministry to condemned prisoners. In England, from the later medieval period, the Franciscan friars were particularly associated with this work. In France and across much of continental Europe, various confraternities, lay religious brotherhoods, had made the accompaniment of the condemned a central part of their spiritual practice. These men arrived in the evening after the sentence had been formally confirmed, and they remained with the condemned through the night. The confession that took place was not a brief formality. It could last for hours. The theology behind it was serious. For the soul to pass into a state of grace, the condemned had to genuinely repent of their sins, not merely recite them. The confessor's job was not just to hear the words, but to test their sincerity, to ask questions, to probe the nature of the contrition, to ensure that what was being expressed was genuine spiritual sorrow and not merely terror of death. This distinction mattered enormously in the medieval theological framework, because a confession made from fear of punishment rather than from genuine love of God was considered imperfect, and an imperfect confession carried uncertain spiritual consequences. What this meant in practice was that the confessor often became an unexpected intimate of the condemned person. The conversations that took place in those night hours were not the conversations of strangers. They were conversations that moved quickly into the deep interior of human life. What had been done, what had been felt, what was regretted, what was feared. Confessors who worked regularly with condemned prisoners developed a particular skill, a kind of pastoral expertise in navigating the specific emotional and spiritual territory of a person facing certain death. Some of them left accounts of what they witnessed. Those accounts are among the most extraordinary documents of medieval emotional life. The cell in which this conversation took place was not, in most cases, a particularly comfortable space. Medieval prisons varied enormously in their physical conditions. Some, particularly those attached to great castles or to the residences of powerful lords, had cells that were tolerably furnished. A wooden bed or straw pallet, a blanket, a small window, perhaps a hook on the wall for a cloak. Others were far more austere. Bare stone, no light, no warmth, the kind of cold, damp darkness that the medieval world associated with the underworld itself. But on the night before an execution, conditions were often improved, at least slightly. This was not an act of pure mercy. It was a practical acknowledgement that a condemned person who was freezing or starving or too exhausted to speak coherently could not make a proper confession, could not conduct themselves with the dignity that the ritual required, and could not be of much use to the machinery of public death that would require them to perform in some sense the following morning. So there were usually candles, there was usually a fire, or at least something to guard against the worst of the cold, and there was usually food. The last meal of the condemned is a concept that persists into the present day, and its medieval roots are more complex than the modern version suggests. In the present day, the last meal is understood primarily as an act of individual choice and modest humanitarian comfort. The condemned person asks for what they want, and within limits they receive it. In the medieval world, the logic was different. Food was not offered merely as comfort, though comfort played a part. Food was offered because the condemned was expected to appear at their execution, looking as much as possible like a living human being rather than a corpse. A person who had not eaten was visibly diminished, pale, weak, hollow-eyed. A person who had eaten, who had slept, who had been given warmth and light and some measure of human attention, appeared different. They appeared present. They could stand upright. They could speak if the execution custom demanded that they speak. This mattered because the execution was a performance, not a performance in any cynical sense, but a performance in the deep medieval sense of the word, a public action carried out according to prescribed form, with meaning accruing to every gesture. The condemned person was one of the central performers, and their performance, whether they died bravely or in fear, whether they spoke well or poorly, whether they forgave their executioner or cursed them, was watched, interpreted, and remembered. A good death was a meaningful death. A bad death, a death characterized by screaming, by desperate struggle, by cursing, by the ugly physical fact of bodily dissolution, was still a death. But it was death that carried less meaning, that resolved less for the watching crowd. The preparation for this performance began the night before. The confessor was part of it. The food was part of it. The clothing laid out for the morning was part of it. In documented cases from England, France, and the Italian city-states, there are records of condemned prisoners being given clean garments for the day of their execution, garments that were not luxurious, but that are whole and decent. In some cases, particularly in Italy, the confraternities that accompanied the condemned to the scaffold provided these garments as part of their service, as a material expression of the spiritual care they were offering. While the confessor sat with the condemned, other things were happening in the building and in the town around it. The executioner in particular was engaged in preparations of his own. The role of the executioner in medieval society is frequently misunderstood. He was not, as popular imagination tends to represent him, a masked and solitary figure lurking at the edges of the social world, shunned and despised. He was a professional. He had a trade, often a hereditary trade, that was recognised by civic authorities, regulated by law, and compensated by fees. The fees were not generous, and the executioner often supplemented his income in ways that added to the general ambivalence about his position. He was frequently given the right to the clothes of the condemned, and in some jurisdictions to certain other property, which created an incentive structure that was not entirely comfortable to contemplate. But the executioner was also a craftsman in the most literal sense, whereas the night before a scheduled execution was a night of craftwork. A blade needed to be sharpened, a rope needed to be prepared, and the preparation of a hanging rope was not a simple matter of cutting a length from a spool. The rope needed to be of sufficient strength, the knot needed to be tied correctly, and the length needed to be calculated with some care, because too long a drop could result in decapitation, and too short a drop could result in slow strangulation, rather than a clean death, both of which were considered failures of craft rather than desirable outcomes. The executioner in a jurisdiction that used decapitation by axe or sword faced different technical challenges. An axe needed to be sharp enough to sever a neck cleanly in one or at most two blows. A sword, which was sometimes used for higher status condemned individuals, particularly in German lands and in France, required both a sharp edge and a skilled technique, because a sword stroke to a neck was a more complex action than an axe blow, and required a particular kind of horizontal cut that could fail in ways that were deeply unpleasant for everyone involved, including the executioner himself, who would face professional and sometimes legal consequences for a botched execution. In some documented cases, the executioner visited the condemned person on the night before the execution and asked for forgiveness. This was not universal, and the custom varied by time and place. But where it is recorded, it appears to have been understood as a genuine ritual, not merely a formality. The executioner explained that he was doing his duty, that he bore no personal malice, that he would do his work as cleanly and quickly as skill allowed. In some accounts, the condemned responded graciously, giving formal forgiveness. In others, the exchange was more complicated, more emotionally freighted, more human. The bells of the town or city marked the hours through the night. Medieval towns were organised around the ringing of bells in a way that modern towns are not, and the hours of a night that led toward an execution were hours that the condemned could follow with exactitude, as the bells announced each passing of the night. Matins, the night office, rang in the small hours. Lauds announced the approach of dawn. Each ringing was a marker, a measurement of the time remaining. Whether the condemned found this comforting or agonizing depended, one imagines, on the individual, and no account that survives is entirely clear on this point. Sleep was often elusive, though not always. There are accounts of condemned prisoners sleeping soundly through their last night, which contemporaries tended to interpret as either spiritual peace or an almost inhuman calm, depending on their view of the condemned. There are many more accounts of insomnia, of restlessness, of the condemned pacing what little space they had, or sitting without moving through the long hours, or engaging in extended prayer that was sometimes frantic and sometimes surprisingly serene. The confessor, if he was diligent and committed to his role, remained present through the night. Some confessors are documented as sleeping in their chair or on a bench in the condemned cell, waking when the condemned person wanted to talk or pray, offering whatever presents they could across those hours. The relationship between confessor and condemned in these long night hours could become genuinely intimate, in the pastoral sense, an intimacy born not of shared history, but of shared extremity, of two people enclosed together in a small space while one of them prepared to die. Food was brought at some point during the night, though the timing and content varied considerably. In England, the typical provision appears to have been simple but adequate. Bread, perhaps a meat or pottage, ale or wine. In Italy, particularly in Florence and some of the other wealthy city-states, the confraternity sometimes provided more elaborate meals, understanding the meal itself as an extension of their ministry, a kind of material comfort that complemented the spiritual comfort they were offering. In France, the provision depended heavily on the status and resources of the condemned. A noble under sentence of death might eat reasonably well on their last night, while a common criminal might receive whatever the prison kitchen could provide, which could be very little. Alcohol was not uncommon as part of the last night's provision. This was understood in a complex way. On one hand, the condemned needed to be clear-headed enough to make a sincere confession and to conduct themselves appropriately the following morning. On the other hand, the physical and psychological torment of a night before execution was real, and some moderate intake of alcohol was understood as a merciful mitigation of that torment rather than an interference with spiritual preparation. The line between these two functions was not always clearly drawn. While the confessor worked and the condemned ate and the night passed, the administrative machinery of the execution was also in motion. Executions in the medieval world were not impromptu events. They required authorization from appropriate authorities, and in some cases multiple levels of authorization. In England, a capital sentence required royal authorization, or the authorization of a royal court, and the documentation surrounding an execution was substantial. Records needed to be kept. The condemned's identity needed to be confirmed. The crime needed to be specified. The authorization for the execution needed to be present and in order. If any of this documentation was missing or incorrect, the execution could not legally proceed. This administrative machinery involved clerks and scribes who worked through the evening preparing the necessary documents, and it involved the sheriff or his deputy who bore the legal responsibility for carrying out the sentence, and who needed to ensure that everything was properly in order. In some cases, the condemned was brought before the relevant authority on the evening before the execution for a final confirmation of the sentence. Not an opportunity for appeal, in most cases, but a formal procedural step that ensured the execution was legally grounded. The crowd that would attend the execution the following morning was already in some sense preparing. Medieval executions were public events, typically held in spaces, a market square, a field outside the town walls, a prominent intersection that could accommodate a large gathering. People came from some distance to attend significant executions, particularly those of notorious criminals or persons of high rank. This gathering required preparation. People arranged to have work covered, made arrangements to be in the right place, in some cases travelled from neighbouring villages or towns. Inns and taverns in towns where a significant execution was scheduled saw increased business on the night before. Not all of this business was celebratory in any simple sense. The motivations that brought people to executions were as complex as the motivation that bring people to any significant public event. Curiosity, civic duty, a desire to be present at a moment of social and moral significance, the particular human fascination with mortality that both attracts and repels. Some of the people drinking in taverns the night before an execution were thinking carefully about the condemned person, wondering about their guilt, their fate, what it meant that their society had arrived at this decision. The family of the condemned, if they had family and if they were present, occupied a particularly difficult position during the night before an execution. In some cases, family members were permitted to visit the condemned in their final hours. In other cases, they were not, either because the relevant authorities did not allow it, or because the family was too far away or too poor to make the journey. When visits did occur, they could be agonizing or strangely peaceful, or both at different moments. But the confessor was often present during family visits, which added another layer of complexity to an already densely layered situation. What was discussed during these family visits? The surviving accounts give fragmentary evidence. Practical matters sometimes took precedence over emotional ones. The condemned might have wishes about the distribution of their property, about the care of their children, about debts owed and debts owing. These wishes might be formally recorded as a kind of final testament, or they might be communicated informally in the hope that the family members present would remember and act on them. There was legal uncertainty about whether these informal communications had any binding force, but they were made anyway because the desire to put things in order, to leave the world in as much order as possible, appears to be a deeply human response to imminent death. In some cases, the condemned wrote letters during their last night. Literacy was not universal in the medieval world, and among those condemned for ordinary crimes it was probably relatively rare. But among those of higher social status, among clergy, among merchants and their families, literacy was common enough that written final communications were sometimes possible. These letters, when they survive, which is not often, are extraordinary documents. They tend toward a kind of clarity that seems to arise from the specific conditions of their composition, from the particular focus that extreme circumstances impose on expression. They deal in essentials. The religious dimension of the night was not limited to the private confession. In some cases, particularly where the condemned was of higher status or was associated with a significant religious community, a mass might be said during the night hours, either in the prison itself if there was a chapel, or in a nearby church. The attendance at this mass by the condemned, accompanied by their confessor and perhaps by guards, was understood as a significant spiritual act, a final participation in the central rite of Christian worship before the condemned passed from the world. This movement from the prison to a church and back again was also in some ways a trial run movement that would occur the following morning, the walk or ride from the prison to the place of execution. That journey was itself a ceremony, a public passage through the streets, and it had its own protocols. The condemned might be on foot or in a cart. They might be accompanied by clergy, by guards, by civic officials. In some cities, the route passed particular churches where the condemned was offered a final opportunity to pray, or where relics might be presented for them to venerate. The nighttime visit to a church, if it occurred, anticipated and prepared for this public passage. As the night wore on and dawn began to approach, the preparations accelerated. The confessor, if still present, would typically assist the condemned in preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for what was to come, going over the words they might want to say, rehearsing the formal acknowledgement of their guilt that was often expected as part of this public execution ritual, discussing what to expect from the physical process of the execution itself. This last point was not always addressed, but where it was, it reflects an interesting aspect of the medieval relationship to death. The condemned was often told, in fairly plain terms, what would happen. If it was a hanging, they might be told that there would be a period of consciousness followed by unconsciousness followed by death, and that this period could vary in length. If it was a decapitation, they might be told that the executioner would signal them when to bend their neck and that they should comply without hesitation, because hesitation made the executioner's work harder and the experience more prolonged. This information was understood as merciful rather than cruel. Knowing what was coming was considered better than not knowing, because it allowed the condemned to engage with the process rather than merely to suffer it passively. The guards who maintained custody through the night were themselves affected by the situation, in ways that the historical record occasionally makes visible. Some guards maintained the professional distance that the role seemed to require. Others became unexpectedly involved with the person they were guarding, engaged by the long night of enforced proximity in ways that blurred the comfortable categories of jailer and condemned. There are accounts of guards weeping. There are accounts of guards who asked the condemned for prayers on their behalf. Understanding the condemned as someone who was about to enter the presence of God and hoping for some intercessory benefit from that proximity. The social hierarchy that governed all of medieval life also governed the night before an execution, but in complex and sometimes subversive ways. A person condemned to death occupied a kind of liminal position in the social structure. They were still technically of whatever rank they had been born into or had achieved, but that rank was in the process of being stripped away, and the stripping away would be made definitively public the following morning. A noble condemned to death might still be addressed with the forms of courtesy appropriate to their rank on their last night, might still eat from something better than the most basic provision, might still have a confessor of higher clerical standing that would be assigned to a common criminal. But the direction of travel was toward a common condition that levelled all distinctions. This levelling was understood in explicitly theological terms in much of the literature that surrounded medieval executions. The sermon or address that was sometimes delivered to the condemned during their last night, or the commentary that appears in accounts written by those who accompanied condemned persons, often returned to the theme that death was the great equalizer, that before God all souls were equal regardless of the distinctions of earthly rank, and that the person who died well, who died in a state of grace, who died with genuine contrition and genuine faith, was in a better position than a person of the highest earthly rank who died badly, meaning in sin or in impenitence. This theology had really consequences for the experience of the night. It meant that the spiritual care offered to a condemned criminal was, in principle at least, as earnest and complete as the spiritual care offered to a dying king. The confessor who sat through the night with a convicted thief was doing work that was understood as genuinely important, not as a charitable gesture to a person of no consequence, but as preparation of a soul for an encounter with God that was as significant as any other soul's encounter with God. Whether this principle was always honoured in practice is another question, and the evidence suggests considerable variation in the quality and seriousness of the spiritual care provided. But the principle itself was present, and it shaped at minimum the formal structure of how the night was organised. The hours before dawn were the most intense. There is something about the small hours of the morning, the period between the depths of the night and the first light, that occupies a particular position in the experience of vigil. For the condemned and those with them, this period was when the abstract fact of imminent death became most concretely present. Dawn would bring the end. Dawn was approaching. In documented accounts from the Italian tradition, where the confraternities left the most detailed records of their accompaniment of the condemned, this period before dawn is described with particular attention. The brothers of the confraternity, who would accompany the condemned to the scaffold itself, would begin their final spiritual ministrations. Images of Christ or of the Madonna were presented for the condemned to contemplate and kiss. The so-called tavelet or laudi, small painted tablets that the confraternities carried as tools of their ministry. These images served several purposes simultaneously. They provided an object of devotion. They focused the mind on spiritual rather than physical concerns, and they functioned practically by being held in front of the condemned's face on the walk to and at the site of execution, partly blocking their view of the crowd and the scaffold. The condemned was also dressed for the morning. This dressing could be simple or elaborate, depending on circumstances, but it almost always involved some attention to the question of what the condemned would look like when they died. This was not vanity in any ordinary sense. It was again connected to the performance dimension of the execution, to the understanding that the condemned person's appearance and comportment were meaningful, that a person who died looking human and composed conveyed something different to the watching crowd than a person who died in rags or obvious physical degradation. In some traditions, the condemned was given a white garment, a smock or shift, that carried explicit symbolic associations with purity and with the white robes of the redeemed in the Book of Revelation. This symbolism was understood and intended, and it contributed to the visual language of the execution as a moral and spiritual event rather than merely a practical one. The question of what the condemned thought and felt during these final hours is, of course, the question that all the documentation approaches but never quite reaches. We have accounts of behaviour, accounts of words spoken, accounts of confessions partially summarised. We do not have direct access to inner experience. The person sitting in a medieval cell in the hours before dawn, listening to the bells, eating or not eating, praying or not praying, talking to a confessor or lying in silence on a straw pallet, inhabited a subjective reality that no amount of documentation can fully reconstruct. What the documentation does allow us to see is the variety of responses. Some condemned people appear, by all accounts, to have achieved something that their contemporaries described as a holy calm, a composed acceptance of their death that was understood as spiritually significant, as evidence of genuine contrition and genuine faith. These individuals were sometimes spoken of after their death in terms that approached hagiography, as though the quality of their dying had partially redeemed the quality of their living. Thus were not calm. Fear was recorded, and fear was understood and to some degree expected. The pastoral literature on the accompaniment of the condemned acknowledged that fear was a natural human response to death, even to a death that the condemned themselves recognized as just, and it offered guidance to confessors on how to work with fear rather than demanding its suppression. The person who was genuinely terrified but genuinely contrite was in a better spiritual position in this literature than the person who appeared calm but had not genuinely confronted the reality of their situation. Anger was also recorded, though less frequently and with more difficulty. A condemned person who expressed anger at their accusers, at the court that had condemned them, at the social conditions that had led to their crime, at God, presented a more complicated pastoral challenge. The theological issue was straightforward. Anger was a sin, and anger at the system that has condemned you could constitute a refusal of the repentance that was necessary for a good death. The practical issue was harder. A person who was angry was not easily led through the stages of spiritual preparation, and the confessor who encountered genuine anger on the last night faced a difficult and sometimes protracted negotiation between the theology of what was required and the human reality of what was possible. There were also those who maintained through their last night that they were innocent. This was not uncommon. The medieval justice system was, by any honest assessment, far from infallible. False accusations were made. Evidence was misinterpreted or fabricated. Confessions were sometimes extracted under conditions that made their reliability questionable. A person who had been unjustly condemned and who knew it was in an extraordinarily difficult position on the night before their execution. The theological framework offered some consolation. A person who died unjustly for a crime they did not commit was understood to be in a particularly favourable spiritual position as a kind of martyr to the imperfections of human justice. But this consolation was not always felt to be adequate by the people to whom it was offered. The confessor who believed, or who came to believe through the course of the long night, that the person they were accompanying was genuinely innocent, faced a terrible tension between their role in the institutional machinery of the execution and their pastoral responsibility to the individual person. The historical record contains a few accounts of confessors who spoke up, who tried at the last moment to intervene, to communicate to the relevant authorities that they had information suggesting the condemnation was unjust. In most of these cases, the execution proceeded regardless. The institutional momentum of a confirmed sentence was very difficult to stop once it had been set in motion, particularly in the short time available between the last night and the morning's proceedings. There were also the practical arrangements of the morning itself to be made during the night. Someone needed to know with precision when the condemned would be moved from the prison to the place of execution, what route would be taken, who would be in the accompanying party, what order of precedence would apply to the various parties involved. These arrangements were made by the relevant authorities, the sheriff in England, the Pustas, relevant official in Italian cities, the local nobles representative in areas under seigneurial justice, and they required coordination between multiple parties who were each responsible for a different aspect of the proceedings. The crowd management implications of a public execution were not trivial. A large crowd attending an execution could become dangerous in ways that were not entirely predictable. There was the general risk of disorder associated with any large public gathering, heightened in this case by the emotional intensity of the occasion. There was the specific risk that the crowd might intervene, either on behalf of the condemned if there was popular sympathy for them, or against the condemned if the crime had excited popular anger and the crowd was minded to anticipate the official execution with violence. Both kinds of intervention occurred in the medieval world, and both required anticipation and management. The presence of civic and religious authorities at the execution was partly a statement of the legitimacy of the proceedings. This killing is authorized. It has been properly processed through the machinery of justice. It is not murder, and partly a practical measure to ensure that the proceedings were carried out in an orderly manner. The number and rank of the authorities present varied with the significance of the case. An ordinary criminal execution might be overseen by a sheriff's deputy and a priest. A high-status execution might bring out senior clergy, civic officials, and in rare cases members of the nobility or even the royal family. The question of relics and intercession deserves separate attention, because it reveals something important about the medieval relationship between the dying and the sacred. The condemned person, in the hours before their execution, was understood as occupying a threshold position that carried unusual spiritual significance. They were about to pass from this world into the next. They were, in some sense, already partly beyond the ordinary conditions of earthly life. This proximity to the threshold of death was understood as giving them a particular relationship to the sacred that living people in their ordinary conditions did not have. This understanding expressed itself in two related ways. On one hand, the condemned might be offered sacred objects, relics, blessed images, holy water, as aids to their final spiritual preparation. On the other hand, the prayers of the condemned might be sought by others as having unusual efficacy, by virtue of their liminal position. Guards who asked condemned prisoners to pray for them were acting on this understanding, and they were not alone. Accounts survive of people who attended executions asking the condemned, as they passed through the crowd on their way to the scaffold, to pray for them, and of condemned persons who complied, blessing those who asked for blessing even in their final moments. This was not, from the medieval theological perspective, sentimental or irrational. It was a coherent expression of a world-view in which the spiritual and material dimensions of existence were thoroughly interpenetrated, in which proximity to the divine threshold carried real consequences, in which the prayers of a dying person carried praetescular weight precisely because of that proximity. The night also had its sounds, and those sounds were part of its texture to a way that is easy to overlook. The prison sounds of the night, guards moving, doors opening and closing, the ambient noise of a building that was never entirely quiet, formed a backdrop to the specific sounds of the cell. The voice of the confessor, the voice of the condemned, the occasional movement, the silence between speech. From outside, the sounds of the town or city, the bells, the occasional movement of people, perhaps the sounds of animals in the night. These sounds connected the condemned to the life of the world they were about to leave, and they also separated them from it, because those sounds came from outside the walls that enclosed them. Cold was a constant physical reality in most medieval prisons for much of the year. Stone walls and stone floors did not retain warmth well, and the provision of heating was inconsistent. The candles that provided light also provided some minimal warmth, and a fire, if there was one, provided more. But the cold was usually present, and it was part of the physical texture of the night in a way that is worth acknowledging because it affected both the physical comfort of the condemned and the physical experience of the confessor and any others present. Cold induces a particular kind of clarity, a sharpness of perception that is different from the sensory experience of warmth, and the long cold night before an execution had a physical character that shaped the mental and spiritual experiences that took place within it. Somewhere in the town, the executioner was sleeping or was unable to sleep. Accounts of executioners are far rarer in the medieval record than accounts of condemned prisoners, partly because executioners were not generally the subjects of the kind of pastoral attention that generated written records. But the executioner's position on the night before an execution was in some ways as strange and demanding as the condemned person's. The executioner was about to perform in public an act that was sanctioned by law and necessary to social order, but that was also, in a most immediate physical sense, a killing. The killing of a human being, even a condemned human being, even in a public, even legally, leaves something behind in the person who performs it. The executioners who served in permanent posts in major cities, and who therefore performed this act repeatedly across a career, were people who had somehow accommodated themselves to a recurring experience that most human beings never encounter once. How they did this accommodation is not well documented, but the fact of it is remarkable. Dawn began to show. The exact moment of the transition from night to day is difficult to describe, particularly in the close quarters of a stone cell, but it was perceptible. A slight increase in the quality of the light in whatever opening the cell possessed, a change in the quality of the air, a shift in the character of the sounds coming from outside as the town began to stir. The bells would ring again, announcing the change of the night offices to the day hours. The final preparations began. If the condemned was to be washed, and there are accounts suggesting that washing was provided in some cases, partly for the condemned's comfort, and partly for the reasons of appearance already discussed. This happened now. If the condemned's clothing needed to be adjusted, it was adjusted. The confessor offered final absolution, the formal pronouncement of forgiveness that was understood as the most significant spiritual act of the entire night's work. The records of these final absolutions are not extensive, but where they exist, they reflect the weight of the moment. The words of absolution were specific, formulaic, drawn from the established liturgical tradition of the Church. They were not improvised, but the moment in which they were spoken carried an urgency and specificity that distinguished them from the same words spoken in ordinary pastoral contexts. These were words spoken to a person who was, within hours, going to die. Whatever theological confidence the confessor held about the efficacy of the words he was speaking, he was also a human being who sat through the night with another human being, and the words were spoken in full consciousness of that. In some accounts, particularly Italian ones, the condemned was now equipped with a linen hood that would cover their face during the walk to the scaffold. This hood served several purposes. It provided some protection against the physical effects of sun and wind on what was often a long walk. It offered a degree of privacy in the middle of what would be a very public event, and it assisted in the direction of the condemned's attention inward toward the prayers and meditations they were continuing to perform, rather than upward toward the crowd and the scaffold they were approaching. The confraternity brothers who accompanied them continued to hold the tavelet, the painted images, before them. The moment of departure from the cell was the end of the night's work. Whatever had been achieved through those hours, whatever spiritual preparation, whatever emotional arrival at some form of acceptance or peace, whatever practical arrangements had been made, was now complete, or as complete as it was going to be. The condemned left the cell and entered the public process that would end at the scaffold, but the night before an execution did not simply end at this moment and vanish without trace. It left marks on those who had participated in it. The confessor carried it with him in the form of memory and in the form of knowledge of a particular human interior that was now gone from the world, knowledge that was bound by the seal of confession, but that could not be entirely contained within that seal as a human experience. The guards who'd maintained the vigil carried it. The executioner, who prepared his tools and possibly visited the condemned and was now preparing to do his work, carried it, and the condemned carried it into the scaffold with them, carried everything that had happened through the night, every prayer said, and every confession made, and every grief expressed, and every peace found or not found, into the final minutes of their life. The night had been preparation. The morning was the thing itself. What strikes anyone who reads the historical accounts of these nights with care is not the brutality that we might expect, though brutality was certainly present in the broader system, but the extraordinary amount of human attention that was devoted to the final hours of even quite ordinary condemned people. The confessor who sat through the night was not performing a minimal duty. He was engaging in sustained, serious pastoral work. The confraternities that accompanied the condemned to the scaffold were investing real resources of time and energy and spiritual commitment into people who, from a purely social calculus, had forfeited their claim on the world's attention. The executioner who asked for forgiveness was performing a human act that acknowledged the condemned's full humanity, even in the moment of preparing to end their life. This is not to romanticize the medieval justice system, which was harsh and often unjust in ways that had real and terrible consequences for real and terrified people. It is simply to observe that alongside and within that harshness, there was a set of practices that took it seriously in their own terms, the humanity of the condemned and the spiritual significance of the passage from life to death. Those practices were not always honoured. They were not always adequate. They did not change the outcome. But they were there, shaped by centuries of accumulated practice, and by a theological framework that insisted, at least in principle, on the value of every soul. To lie in the dark of a medieval cell, in the hours before dawn, listening to the bells count out the night, with a confessor sitting nearby and candlelight casting moving shadows on stone walls, is to be in a situation that no modern parallel quite matches. It is to be at the extreme edge of what human experience can contain, in conditions that strip away almost everything except the most essential dimensions of being alive. The condemned person in those hours was not a symbol or a moral lesson or a narrative device. They were a person, with a past and a body and an interior life, facing the end of all three in a particular room on a particular night, attended by other people who were doing their best within the limitations of their time and their understanding to make that night as human as it could be. The candle burned lower, the bells rang. The cold deepened in the hours before dawn, and then, almost imperceptibly, began to ease. Outside, the town stirred, and in the cell, the work of the night continued until there was no more night left to work in, and the door opened and the morning came. In thinking about what these nights meant, it is worth pausing on the question of what they tell us about the society that organised them. A society that devotes significant institutional and spiritual resources to the final hours of a condemned person is a society that holds, at least in principle, that those final hours matter, that the condition of the condemned person's soul at the moment of death is important enough to justify the expenditure of priestly time and confraternity, effort, and food and candles and attention. This principle coexisted in this medieval world with a system of justice that could be arbitrary, that depended heavily on social status, that used torture as an investigative tool, and that imposed death as a penalty for a range of crimes that no contemporary system would treat as capital offences. The coexistence of these things, the genuine pastoral care on the one hand, the often brutal and uncertain justice on the other, is one of the characteristic tensions of medieval social life, a tension that does not resolve neatly in either direction. The night before a medieval execution is a small window into this larger reality. It shows us a world that was simultaneously more attentive to certain dimensions of human experience, the spiritual, the ritual, the communal, than our world tends to be, and less attentive to others, the procedural, the evidential, the material rates of the accused. It shows us people doing their best, within the limits of what their world knew and valued, to make the passage from life to death as meaningful as possible. And it shows us, in the most fundamental sense, people, the confessor who stayed through the night, the condemned who prayed or did not pray, who slept or could not sleep, who was afraid or was calm or was both at different hours the same night, the guards at the door, the bells in the dark, the candle burning down, the slow approach of a dawn that was the end of preparation, and the beginning of the last thing. These are human facts, and they deserve to be held as such, not as curiosities from a barbaric past, not as illustrations of medieval cruelty, but as evidence of the persistent human need to find meaning at the edge of experience, to surround even the most terrible events with ritual and attention and the presence of other people. That need is not medieval, it is not modern, it is simply human, and it was there in the cold cells of the medieval world just as it is here in us now, listening to this in the dark, on the quiet edge of our own night. Sleep now. The bells have all been rung. The night is long, and you are far from any scaffold. Let the darkness be simply darkness, the soft, unhurried darkness of a night that has no terminus but morning, and a morning that holds nothing but another day. There are details in the surviving records of medieval executions that historians encounter, and then cannot entirely set aside, details that lodge themselves in memory the way that very specific human facts tend to do, because they resist the simplification that larger narratives require. One such detail comes from the records of the Florentine Confraternity of the Blacks, the Compagnia dei Neri, which maintained meticulous documentation of their accompaniment of condemned prisoners from the mid-14th century onward. In those records, among the liturgical procedures and the spiritual assessments and the formal notations of execution dates, there appear small observations about the condemned people themselves, what they ate, how they slept, what they said in their final hours. And in those small observations across 6 centuries of distance, something persists that is not reducible to a historical analysis. A man condemned for robbery, described as young, who spent his last night singing quietly to himself, songs that the confraternity brothers recognised but did not name. A woman condemned for poisoning, whose composure through the entire night impressed the friars attending her as something that went beyond the ordinary forms of piety, who asked at one point whether they thought she would see her children after death, and who seemed comforted by the answer, whatever it was. A soldier condemned for desertion and subsequent violence, who wept without stopping for the first 3 hours of the night, and then stopped abruptly and spent the remaining hours asking the confessor questions about theology that the confessor described in his account as genuine and searching. These are individuals, they are not types, they are not illustrations of the medieval experience of execution. They are people who happen to have been present at one of the most exhaustively documented social rituals of the medieval world, and whose individuality occasionally breaks through the documentary record in the form of small, specific, memorable human facts. The documentary record that surrounds medieval executions is extensive, partly because the medieval world was unusual in comparison to the ancient world, in the degree to which it generated written records of legal and institutional processes. The Church's administration was record-keeping in nature, it kept sacramental records, it documented pastoral activities, it maintained archives that served both institutional memory and legal function. The emerging civic institutions of the later medieval period followed similar practices. The result is a paper trail, uneven and incomplete, but real, that allows historians to reconstruct in unusual detail the procedures surrounding a condemned person's final hours. That paper trail was not created with the intention of providing future historians with material for reconstruction. It was created for functional reasons, to establish legal authorization, to document compliance with the required procedures, to maintain institutional continuity across the inevitable turnover of personnel. The confraternity brothers who wrote their accounts were writing for the confraternity, not for posterity. The confessors who occasionally committed their experiences to writing were writing for their own spiritual processing, or for the instruction of other confessors, not for an audience they imagined as extending across time. This means that the accounts have the quality of functional documents rather than literary ones. They tend toward the spare and the procedural, and the moments of individual human specificity that appear in them do so almost incidentally. There's as background against which the main procedural narrative is playing out, which makes those moments, when they appear, feel more rather than less significant, because they were not intended as literary effects. The architecture of the spaces in which these final nights took place is itself worth attending to, because architecture shapes experience in ways that are not always consciously recognized. The cells of medieval prisons were almost universally built of stone, because stone was the most durable and available building material in most of the regions where significant medieval prisons existed, and because the qualities of stone, heaviness, solidity, permanence, resistance, were appropriate to the function of containment. Stone also has acoustic properties that differ from wood and plaster. It reflects sound in particular ways. It absorbs and releases cold and heat on its own schedule. It has a smell that is distinctive and associated in most human sensory memories with age and depth and the underground. The cells were, in most cases, small. Not always. High-status prisoners were sometimes held in considerably larger spaces, and some prisons of the later medieval period had facilities that were designed to be at least minimally tolerable for extended occupation. But the cells in which ordinary condemned prisoners spent their final nights were typically small enough that two people could fill them to capacity, and the presence of a confessor and sometimes additional guards in an already confined space created a density of human presence that was physically inescapable. This physical density had consequences. It meant that the bodily reality of every person in the cell was constantly present to every other person. Their breathing, their warmth or cold, their smell, their movement. The confessor sitting through the night with the condemned was not engaged in a purely spiritual or intellectual exercise. It was a fully embodied experience, conducted in close quarters, with all the physical particularity that entails. The medieval world was, generally speaking, less squeamish about bodily proximity than the modern world, less invested in the spatial boundaries between bodies that modern culture tends to require. But even by medieval standards, the intimacy of a night's vigil in a small stone cell was unusual and demanding. The confessor's discomfort, if he experienced it, was understood as part of the ministry. The pastoral literature on the accompaniment of condemned prisoners acknowledged that the work was physically and spiritually demanding, that it took a toll on those who performed it, and that this toll was meaningful. It was a form of participation in the condemned person's suffering, a concrete expression of the spiritual solidarity that the ministry was supposed to embody. This was not merely a theological formulation. Confessors who worked regularly with condemned prisoners did show signs in their accounts of carrying the weight of those nights in ways that were visible in their writing. The question of smell is one that historical accounts tend to avoid because it seems somehow indelicate, but it was a constant feature of medieval prison life and deserves acknowledgement. Medieval prisons did not have adequate sanitation by any standard, and the smell of a space where people had been confined, often for days before their execution, was significant, though the provision of better conditions on the final night, with more air, more light, access to washing if it was provided, it was partly an attempt to mitigate this reality, but it could not entirely eliminate it. The confessor who entered a prison cell to attend a condemned person was entering a space with very specific olfactory character, and that character was part of the sensory texture of the night. Incense was sometimes used in the prison spaces, both for its practical qualities as a deodorizing agent and for its symbolic associations with worship and with the sacred. A priest moving through a prison corridor with incense was doing something that was simultaneously practical and liturgical, and the overlap between those two functions was not unusual in the medieval world, which did not draw the boundary between the practical and the sacred in the same place that modernity tends to draw it. The role of music in the final night is underexplored in the historical literature, but present enough in the sources to warrant attention. The liturgical prayers that form the backbone of the spiritual preparation, the psalms, the litanies, the specific prayers for the dying, were frequently sung rather than spoken, even in the informal context of a prison cell rather than a church. Medieval liturgical culture was a sung culture to a degree that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective, in which the boundary between speech and song in sacred contexts has been almost completely erased. The Psalms in particular were understood as music as well as text, and they were frequently performed, even in informal devotional contexts, in the sung forms that the liturgical tradition prescribed. What this meant in practice was that the night before an execution, in at least some documented cases, involved singing. The singing of the confessor or the confraternity brothers, sometimes joined by the condemned, of the traditional liturgical texts that the situation called for. This singing in a stone cell in the small hours of the morning is an extraordinarily particular sensory fact, and it is one that the historical record, when it mentions it at all, tends to mention in passing, is background to the main spiritual work, rather than as a significant event in its own right. But singing in a stone cell at night, with the person who is going to die in the morning, is not a background fact. It is a foreground fact. It represents the decision to insert beauty, even minimal beauty, into an experience that had very little of it otherwise. The beauty of the human voice in the formal patterns of liturgical melody. The beauty of words shaped into art over centuries of repetition, offered up in the worst possible circumstances as an expression of something that the circumstances alone could not extinguish. The theology behind the singing was clear. The psalms and liturgical prayers were not human inventions but divinely inspired texts, and their performance was an act of worship that was appropriate in any circumstance, however extreme. But the human experience behind the theology was also real. People sang together in a stone cell at night, because it was something they could do, because it connected them to something larger than the cell and the night and the approaching morning, because the act of producing beauty in circumstances that seemed to preclude beauty was itself a form of resistance to the complete dominion of those circumstances. When we think about what the medieval world understood and we do not, this is perhaps near the centre of it, not the theology which we can read and understand intellectually, but this practice of inserting liturgical beauty into extreme situations, this habitual resort to sung prayer as a response to what could not be changed. It is a practice that has largely been lost in the modern world, not because the modern world is indifferent to beauty or to the extreme situations that call for it, but because the specific form of that practice, the communal sung liturgy as a default response to extremity, no longer occupies the central position in cultural life that it occupied in the medieval world. The condemned prisoner who sang psalms in their final night was not performing an extraordinary act of piety. They were doing what everyone around them did in the relevant circumstances. They were reaching for the available form of expression that culture had provided for exactly this kind of moment, and using it. That the form happened to be beautiful was not incidental. It was part of why it worked, why it provided whatever comfort and meaning it provided. But the beauty was in service of the function, not an end in itself. This is in some ways the key to understanding many things about medieval life that can otherwise seem puzzling or strange from a modern perspective. The elaborate ritual that surrounded the condemned person's final night was not decoration. It was not performance in the cynical sense. It was function. It served real purposes, spiritual and practical, that the people involved in it understood and took seriously. The beauty of the form, where it was present, was bound up with the function, not separable from it. Now think about the morning that this night was preparing for. The morning itself, the execution, is in some sense outside the scope of what we've been considering, but it throws light back on the night, because the night is only comprehensible in relation to the morning it was serving. The execution was a public event of considerable social significance. It was attended by crowds. It was witnessed by officials. It was preceded by the condemned person's journey through the streets, which was itself a public procession. And it was understood to accomplish something, but not just the physical death of the condemned, but something broader, something that involved the community as a whole. Medieval theories of justice were complex and not entirely consistent, but one of the things that a public execution was understood to accomplish was the restoration of a social and moral order the condemned person's crime had disrupted. The crime had created a breach. The punishment closed the breach, and the closing of the breach required public witnessing, because the disruption had been public and the restoration needed to be equally so. This understanding gave the execution an inherently theatrical quality. Theatrical in the sense that it required an audience, and that the audience's witness was part of what made it effective, not merely an incidental feature. The condemned person's role in this theatre was significant. They were expected, ideally, to behave in ways that confirm the justice of the sentence, that expressed genuine repentance, that demonstrated that the social and moral order being restored was one that the condemned themselves, in their final clarity, recognized as legitimate. A condemned person who died badly, who denied guilt, who cursed the court, who struggled against the executioner, was not simply making the executioner's job harder. They was disrupting the theatrical logic of the event, refusing to play the role that the script required. This is why the night before was so important. It was the rehearsal for the performance. The confessor was not only attending to the condemned person's soul, he was, whether he thought of it in these terms or not, also preparing the condemned person for their public role the following morning. This is not to suggest that the pastoral care was cynical, or that it was merely a function of the theatrical requirements of the execution. The theology and the theatre were deeply entangled in the medieval world, and it is not possible, nor useful, to try to separate them into pure categories. The confessor who prepared the condemned person for a good death was simultaneously doing genuine spiritual work and serving the requirements of the public execution. These things were not in contradiction. They were two aspects of the same function. The condemned person who was well prepared, who had genuinely confessed and been genuinely absolved, who had made peace with God and with those they had wronged, who had said goodbye to their family in a way that was complete and unfinished, was also the condemned person who was most likely to behave at the scaffold in the way the theatrical logic required. The spiritual state and the public performance were connected, because the inner state expressed itself outwardly, and the outward expression was what the crowd saw. When a condemned person died well, when they spoke clearly and repentantly from the scaffold, when they thanked the executioner, when they prayed aloud for the community and asked for the community's prayers in return, when they submitted calmly to the physical process of their death, the crowd witnessed something that the medieval world found genuinely meaningful, not a spectacle of cruelty, or not only that, but a confirmation of the moral and spiritual order that the crime had threatened. The condemned person was, in their death, affirming the values they had violated in that life. This was understood as redemptive, for the individual soul and for the social fabric. This is a way of thinking about death and justice that is quite foreign to modern sensibility, but it is worth trying to inhabit it, even briefly, because it explains so much about why the night before mattered so much, why so many people were involved in it, why it was organised with such care. The night before was the preparation for a public act that was understood to have real social and spiritual consequences, and the quality of that preparation affected the quality of the act. What happened when things went wrong? When the condemned did not play their assigned role? When the execution itself was technically botched? When the crowd's response was not what the authorities expected? Is also part of the history, and it illuminates the norm by showing what happened when it failed. When a condemned person died badly, when they screamed or struggled or cursed, or denied their guilt, their end, or collapsed in fear so completely that they could not be got to the scaffold without physical compulsion, the crowd's response was complex. Contemporary accounts describe unease, discomfort, the specifically medieval version of what we might call cognitive dissonance, the sense that what was happening did not fit the expected pattern, that the moral and spiritual order the execution was supposed to restore was not being restored, that something had gone wrong at a level that was not merely practical. In some cases, a bad death could generate sympathy for the condemned that threatened to tip over into disorder. If the condemned seemed genuinely innocent, or genuinely terrified, in a way that emphasized their humanity over their criminality, or simply seemed to suffer too obviously and too much, the crowd could turn, not necessarily against the authorities, but against the neat moral structure of the event, developing a collective uncertainty about whether what they were witnessing was justice or something uglier. The night before was prophylactic against this kind of failure. If the condemned arrived at the scaffold composed, prepared, visibly engaged in the spiritual dimensions of their death rather than merely the physical ones, the crowd was given something it could engage with as witnesses to a morally significant event rather than merely spectators of a killing. The pastoral care was, among other things, a form of quality control for the public performance of justice. There is something in this that could be read as cynical. The spiritual care instrumentalized in the service of the social theatre, and something that could be read as genuinely compassionate. The recognition that a person who was spiritually prepared died better, in the sense of with less suffering and more dignity, than a person who was not. Both readings are probably partially correct, and neither is entirely adequate, because the medieval world did not draw the distinction between the spiritual and the instrumental in the same place we do. In the great cities of the later medieval period, where executions were most frequent and most formally organised, the infrastructure surrounding them became increasingly elaborate. London, Paris, Florence, Venice, Milan. In each of these cities, by the end of the 14th century, there were established procedures, established personnel, established institutions for the management of executions, and the night before an execution was part of that infrastructure in ways that were carefully codified. The Florentine confraternities, whose records are among the most complete, show a development over the 2 centuries of their documented activity, from relatively simple accompaniment to an increasingly elaborate system of spiritual, practical, and administrative support. By the mid-15th century, the brothers of the relevant confraternity would be with the condemned from the moment the sentence was formally confirmed through the entire night to the scaffold itself, performing a continuous ministry that covered every phase of the transition from condemned prisoner to executed criminal. What motivated these men to do this work is the question that their own accounts address but do not fully answer. Religious motivation was clearly primary. They understood themselves as doing God's work, as performing a corporal and spiritual work of mercy that would benefit their own souls, as well as those of the condemned they accompanied. Civic motivation was also present. They were members of Florentine civic society, and their confraternity was embedded in that society in ways that gave its work a dimension of civic responsibility, as well as purely religious one. Personal motivation is harder to assess, but the accounts suggest that some of the brothers found the work genuinely compelling, that the intimacy of the vigil and the intensity of the experience had a quality that they valued and returned to. There's also, in the confraternity accounts, a quality that might be described as professional pride, the pride of people who do difficult, specialized work well, who have developed skills that others do not have, who are recognized within their community as the people who do this particular thing when it needs to be done. The brothers were not amateur religious enthusiasts improvising their way through a demanding situation. They were trained, experienced practitioners of a specific ministry, and their accounts reflect the authority and competence of experience. The variety of condemned people they accompanied gave them an unusually broad view of human experience. Over the years of a brother's active participation in the confraternity, he would sit through the final nights of people of widely varying ages, backgrounds, circumstances, and dispositions. He would accompany people who were genuinely guilty and people who were probably not. He would sit with people who found peace and people who did not. He would witness deaths that were quick and deaths that were prolonged. The cumulative weight of this experience, if it did not break a person, and presumably it sometimes did, produced a kind of understanding of human nature under extreme conditions that very few people in any era acquire. One way to appreciate the strangeness and specificity of this position is to consider what the brother of the confraternity brought with him into the cell on the last night. Not only his person, his presence, his training and pastoral skills, but also the accumulated weight of all the other last nights he had participated in. Every condemned person he had accompanied before was in some sense present with him as he began this particular vigil. He carried a kind of experiential palimpsest, a layering of previous encounters with death that informed and shaped his engagement with the present one. This is not unique to this particular historical context. Anyone who works regularly with dying people develops something similar, a relationship to death as a recurring presence, as something that has been encountered before and will be encountered again. It modifies the experience of any particular encounter. But the medieval confraternity brothers' relationship to death had some specific qualities that distinguished it. Death by execution is different from death by illness. It has a specific time, a specific cause, a specific social context, a specific ritual surround. The confraternity brothers' accumulated experience was an experience of this specific kind of death, and it gave him a particular kind of knowledge and a particular kind of presence. The people who attended these last nights professionally, confessors, confraternity brothers, prison officials, executioners, were not, for the most part, people of high social status. They were mid-level ecclesiastics and pious laymen and low-ranking civic officials and working craftsmen. They were, in other words, the kind of people who are usually invisible in historical records, whose inner lives and whose experiences leave almost no trace. The fact that the institutional context of the execution generated written records about their activities allows us, unusually, a partial view of what those activities were. That partial view is humbling in a specific way. It shows people doing difficult, demanding, meaningful work in circumstances that most of us would find very hard, doing it with competence and often with evident care, being paid badly or not at all for the spiritual and pastoral dimensions of their service, leaving behind records that were never intended to convey their own significance, but that carry it nonetheless. The condemned prisoner in the cell is the obvious centre of attention in any account of the night before an execution. They are the person whose mortality is in question, whose life is about to end, whose story is reaching its literal conclusion. But the people around them, the confessor, the confraternity brothers, the guards, the executioner somewhere across the town, are also present in the night, and their presence is not merely instrumental. They are there not just to serve a function, but to be human beings in a situation that demands the best that human beings can offer. In an extended confrontation with something that does not yield to goodwill or competence or prayer, but that is changed in some measure by the quality of the human presence that surrounds it. There is a question that hovers over all of this that is never quite answered in the records. What did it feel like from the inside to be the condemned person who arrived at the dawn in a state of genuine peace? Not the peace of exhaustion or resignation, but what the medieval sources sometimes call virapax, true peace, the condition that the entire night had been organized to produce, in which the approaching death was genuinely accepted, the sins genuinely repented, the soul genuinely prepared. The accounts of confessors and confraternity brothers suggest that this condition was real, that it was distinct from mere resignation or from the numbing of extreme fear, that it had a specific quality that those who witnessed it recognized and described. They described it as lightness, as clarity, as a kind of presence that was unusual, the condemned person being more fully present in the final hours than they had been at any earlier point in the night. They described people who seemed to have arrived at a place that was entirely their own, who were in some sense no longer suffering the night but simply inhabiting it, in a state that the observers understood as grace. If these descriptions are accurate, and there is no reason to assume that all of them were merely conventional, then the night before an execution could sometimes produce an outcome that was genuinely remarkable by any human standard. A person in extremity, having passed through all the stages of the night's preparation, arriving at the end of it in a condition of unusual clarity and calm. This was the outcome the entire institution was designed to produce, and the fact that it sometimes succeeded is worth acknowledging. What followed from that clarity and calm, the physical death at the scaffold, whatever came after, is beyond the scope of what we can know. But the night itself, the long and carefully organized human effort to make the passage from life to death as meaningful and as prepared as possible, stands on its own as evidence of what a society can do at its best when it takes the interior lives of its members seriously, even in the cases where those members have done the worst things that society must respond to. The medieval world was not a world we would want to return to. Its justice was too uncertain, its cruelties too casual, its exclusions too broad. But it was also a world that knew something about the deep structure of human experience, about what people need when they're facing the extreme, about the role of ritual and community and spiritual attention in making bearable what cannot be made good. That knowledge was imperfect and often inconsistently applied, but it was present, built into the institutional life of the society in ways that took for granted that these things mattered, that a condemned person's soul was worth caring for, that the night before an execution was worth organizing with care. We have lost some of that knowledge, or at least we have lost the institutional forms that expressed it. We have gained other things in exchange, a more equitable justice system in principle, and a more systematic protection of individual rights, and a less casual relationship to the use of death as a social instrument. These gains are real and important, but something is also absent that was present in the stone cells of the medieval world, in the long nights attended by candlelight and the sound of bells and the voices of confessors, in the practice of treating even the condemned as people whose inner lives deserved full human attention. The bells rang through the night, the candles burned, the confessor prayed, and asked, and listened. The condemned sat with what they had, with what a night had given them, with what they had managed to arrive at through the hours of darkness and cold and extreme proximity to the end. And when the dawn came, it came for everyone in the cell, for the confessor, for the guards, for the distant executioner, not just for the condemned. It was everyone's dawn, and everyone would carry some part of the night forward into it. That is what really happened the night before a medieval execution. Not the simple waiting we imagine, not the blank hours we tend to skip over in the telling, but all of this, the prayers and the food and the candles and the confessions and the singing and the cold and the bells and the human presency, maintained through the dark hours in the service of something that everyone involved understood as necessary, even those who could not have explained precisely why. Rest now. Let the image of that candlelit cell recede gently into the past where it belongs, along with all the people who inhabited it, along with all the nights that were organised around exactly this kind of care, along with all the bells that rang and all the prayers that were said in the depths of nights that are long finished. They are finished. The nights are over. The only night that remains is yours, and it is quiet, and it is safe, and nothing is required of you in it but rest. The medieval world is very far away. Sleep is very close. Let the one give way to the other, slowly as the bells of a distant and imagined town ring once more in the dark and fall silent, and the candle gutters and goes out. To go a little deeper into the texture of the night, it helps to think about time. Not clock tom, which the medieval world measured approximately and inconsistently, but experiential time. The way that hours feel when they are being lived through from the inside, especially hours in which the future holds something of extreme significance. Modern psychology has a reasonable amount to say about the phenomenology of anticipation, about what happens to a person's experience of the present when they know with certainty what the future holds. In ordinary life, the future is uncertain, and this uncertainty allows the mind a kind of freedom. It can range across possible futures, can hope and plan and imagine alternatives. When the future becomes certain, and particularly when it becomes certainly terrible, the mind loses this freedom. The future compresses the present, or it expands it unbearably, or it does both at the same time in alternating waves. For the condemned person in the medieval cell, the future was as certain as any human future has ever been. They knew with complete precision what would happen to them in the morning. They knew the time, roughly, and the place, and the means. The only uncertainty was the quality of the experience, whether it would be quick or slow, whether the executioner was skilled or not, whether their courage would hold or fail. These uncertainties were real but limited. The fact of death was not uncertain at all. What does certainty of this kind do to the experience of a night? The surviving accounts suggest that it did different things to different people, and that within a single night it could do different things at different hours. The early part of the night, when the sentence had just been confirmed and the confessor had just arrived and the full reality of the situation was still, in some sense, assimilating itself. This part of the night seems, from the accounts, to have had a particular quality of unreality, as though the mind was still running its ordinary programs of hope and alternative construction, even in the face of evidence that those programs were no longer appropriate. The middle hours of the night, after the initial shock had passed and before the exhaustion of the small hours had arrived, seem often to have been the most active in terms of spiritual work. Confession, prayer, conversation with the confessor, whatever practical arrangements needed to be made. This was the productive part of the night, when the condemned person was engaged enough to participate fully in the rituals that were available to them. The small hours, the period between roughly midnight and 3 in the morning, the hours that monastic culture called the vigil, and that secular culture simply called the depths of the night, were often the hardest. The energy of the earlier hours was depleted. Dawn was not yet close enough to provide a sense of approaching resolution. The cold was at its most intense. The bells marked a time that was neither early nor late, a time that had no natural anchor in the daily rhythms of waking and sleeping. This was the time, in many accounts, when fear was most acute, when prayer was most desperate, when the confessor's presence was most essential. And then, very gradually, the quality of the night changed. The bells announced Lord's, the office that preceded dawn. The darkness outside, if there was a window, began to shift almost imperceptibly. The sounds of the town changed in character, the specific sounds of a settlement beginning to stir, the distant sounds of animals and early risers, the quality of sound that distinguishes the end of night from the depth of it. And something in the condemned person, if the accounts are to be believed, often shifted along with it. Not always peace, sometimes simply exhaustion, the body having consumed its reserves of anxiety and arriving at a kind of hollow quiet on the other side. Sometimes something more like acceptance, the resignation that comes when resistance to a fact has been fully attempted and has fully failed, and what remains is simply the fact. Sometimes, in the accounts that are most remarkable, something that really does seem like peace, in a more than mechanical sense, a condition of the spirit that the confessors described in terms that were borrowed from mystical theology, but that they were applying to very ordinary people in very extreme circumstances. The approach of dawn was the approach of resolution. Whatever the condemned person's spiritual condition, whatever the quality of the night that had just passed, the dawn ended the waiting. It was not good news, it was the end. But there is something in the human psychology that responds to the end of uncertainty with a kind of relief, even when the resolution of that uncertainty is death. The condemned person who had lived through the night now had a very small number of hours left to live. The counting was nearly over. The uncertainty about how to be in these final hours was nearly resolved. This is one of the things that makes the accounts of the final morning so consistently different in quality from the accounts of the night before. The night is characterized by intensity, by variation, by the kind of extreme oscillation between states that sustained psychological stress produces. The morning, what the accounts describe of it, the period between the first light and the moment of departure from the cell, is often characterized by a different quality altogether, a kind of a clarity and simplicity that may in part be the byproduct of exhaustion, but that seems in many cases to be something more than that. Confessors who wrote about the final morning often described the condemned person as more fully themselves than they had been at any point in the night. Not calmer necessarily, not less frightened, but more present, more direct, more honest in some way that the long night had somehow produced. The persona that most people maintain in social contexts, the protective surface that moderates and manages the expression of inner states, had been stripped away by the long night of extremity, and what remained was something more essential, less mediated. This quality of presence is something that contemporary accounts of palliative care and end-of-life situations also describe, and it is not unique to the medieval context. People who are genuinely dying, who are fully aware that they are dying, and who have moved through the various stages of that awareness to some kind of arrival at the fact itself, often have a quality of presence that people around them notice and remember. The medieval condemned person who was well prepared had arrived at something analogous to this quality, though by a different and more abrupt path, through the concentrated work of a single long night rather than the slower process of a terminal illness. The preparation that the night provided was also, in a way that is easy to overlook, a kind of gift. Not a gift that anyone would choose. The circumstances were as terrible as circumstances get, but a gift in the sense that it gave the condemned person time and attention and resources that many people who die suddenly do not have. A person killed in an accident or dying suddenly of illness does not have the opportunity to confess, to settle accounts, to say goodbye, to arrive at whatever form of peace is available to them. The condemned person, for all the horror of their situation, did have that opportunity, and the night was organized specifically to provide it. Medieval commentators on the plight of the condemned occasionally made this observation, not to minimize the severity of the situation, but to make theological and pastoral sense of it. The condemned person who prepared well for death was understood as being, in some ways, privileged over the person who died suddenly and unprepared because they had the time and the spiritual resources to make the transition that was required. This was a genuine theological position, not a rationalization, and it shaped the pastoral approach to the accompaniment of the condemned in significant ways. It also shaped the social interpretation of the public execution. The condemned person who died well at the scaffold had not merely been executed, they had, in some sense, transcended the execution, had used the terrible circumstances of their death to achieve a spiritual condition that was held up as exemplary. The execution was supposed to be, among other things, a public display of the consequences of crime, a deterrent to future wrongdoing. But it was also, when the condemned person prepared and performed well, a public display of the possibility of redemption, of grace operating even in the worst circumstances, of the human spirit's capacity to find its way to something like peace, even when facing the worst that society could impose on it. This redemptive dimension of the execution was taken seriously by the crowds that attended them. The decision of the condemned to forgive their executioner, which many condemned people made publicly, in the final moments before their death, was understood not as a mere formality but as an act of genuine moral and spiritual significance, a public demonstration of the Christian virtue of forgiveness, in circumstances that would test it to the absolute limit. The crowd witnessed this, understood it, and responded to it in ways that contemporary accounts describe as something between awe and consolation. A crowd watching a person forgive the person who were about to kill them, in public, in the final moments of their life, was being shown something extreme and real, whether or not they believed in the specific theological framework that surrounded the act. They are witnessing a human being choosing to do something very difficult at the most extreme possible moment. This was not nothing. It was something that resonated at a level below theology, at the level of raw human respect for extreme acts of will and spirit, and the night before had made it possible. The long, slow, carefully organised night, the confessor and the candles and the food and the bells and the prayers and the cold and the terrible intimacy of a small space and two or more human beings confronting the most extreme fact that existence offers, had produced, in the best cases, a person capable of that public act. The night was the preparation. The morning was the fruit of it. The executioner's role in this drama deserves one more consideration before we let it rest. The executioner asked for forgiveness the night before, in some documented cases, and was given it. The following morning, on the scaffold, the condemned asked the executioner for forgiveness in return. Forgiveness for the burden that was being placed on the executioner's conscience, for the act that the condemned was compelling the executioner to perform. And the executioner, in the forms that the custom prescribed, gave that forgiveness. The two people most directly implicated in the act of execution, the one who died and the one who killed, ritually forgave each other before the act took place. This exchange, when it occurred, was not an empty form. It was genuine acknowledgement of the complex moral position of both parties, an acknowledgement that the execution implicated everyone involved, that it was not simply the condemned person's problem or the executioner's problem, but a shared human situation that required a shared human response. The exchange of forgiveness was that response, an assertion that even in this, the most extreme reduction of one human being by another to a mere object of institutional procedure, the personhood of both remained present and deserving of acknowledgement. After the execution, the bodies of the condemned were typically taken for burial by the same confraternities or religious orders that had attended them through the final night. In many cities there were specific burial grounds for executed criminals, not the consecrated ground of the main cemeteries, which was sometimes denied to criminals, a ground that was associated with the confraternities and that received the bodies of those they had accompanied. The confraternities maintained these burial grounds, prayed for the souls of those buried in them, held commemorative services for the executed on the anniversaries of their deaths. This practice of commemoration is the final thread in the night story, and it is worth following briefly. The condemned person who had been accompanied through their final night by the confraternity brothers did not simply disappear from the community's attention after their death. They were prayed for, they were remembered. Their name, when it was known, was inscribed in the confraternity's records, and on the anniversary of their death prayers were said for their soul. This ongoing practice of commemoration was understood as an extension of the pastoral care that had begun with the final night, a continued spiritual service to someone who was now beyond the reach of earthly pastoral care, but who remained, in the Catholic theological framework, capable of benefiting from the prayers of the living. This meant that the relationship between the confraternity and the condemned person did not end at the scaffold. It continued into whatever came after, into a landscape of posthumous spiritual care that was as real and as seriously intended as the care of the final night itself. The confraternity brothers who had sat through the night, who had walked beside the condemned to the scaffold, who had held the painted images before their dying eyes, were also the people who said masses for their souls in the weeks and years after their death. who kept them in a kind of continued community membership that death alone did not sever. This is perhaps the most foreign aspect of the entire picture to modern sensibility. The idea that a person executed for a crime should remain the subject of communal, spiritual care after their death, that their continued spiritual welfare was a concern of the community that had put them to death, that prayers said for their soul had real efficacy in real spiritual circumstances. All of this requires a degree of imaginative investment in the medieval theological framework that most modern people do not find natural. But it is worth the investment because it completes the picture. The night before, a medieval execution was not an isolated event. It was part of a continuous ministry that extended from the moment of condemnation to beyond the moment of death, a ministry that took seriously in the most sustained and practical way the proposition that every soul was of infinite value, that no circumstance of earthly life, including the worst crimes and the most extreme punishments, could eliminate that value, and that the spiritual care of souls in extremity was work worth doing fully and well. That work was done in the medieval world by ordinary people in ordinary conditions in cold stone cells by the light of candles, through the long hours of nights that the bells counted out with patient regularity. They did it because their theology required it, and because their human decency responded to it, and because the work itself, for all its difficulty, had a quality that the people who did it recognized as meaningful in the deepest sense. The night is long, the bells ring. The candle burns in the dark of a cell that is far away and long ago, and the voices of the people who occupied it, the confessor's quiet questions, the condemned person's responses, the psalms sung in the small hours, the simple human sounds of people in close quarters through a night that demanded everything they had. Those voices are gone now, absorbed into the silence of the centuries. But they were there. They were real. And something about them, something about the quality of what those people did in those hours, travels across the distance that separates us from them, and arrives here in this quiet moment, not as history exactly, but as recognition. The recognition of something human doing its best in the dark, surrounded by care that it had not chosen and could not refuse, moving through the night toward whatever waited on the other side of it. Sleep well. The night is yours, and it asks nothing of you. And morning is still a long way off, and everything that needs to happen between now and then is simply the slow, easy work of rest. Consider the material objects of the final night, those small tangible things that occupied the space between the walls and the people. A candle, a cup, a piece of bread, a blanket, a crucifix or small devotional image, a rosary perhaps, or a string of prayer beads that the confessor placed in the condemned person's hands. These objects were not symbolic in any abstract sense. They were literal physical things, occupying literal physical space, handled and used by literal physical hands, in the darkness of a specific cell on a specific night. But they also carried meaning, dense and layered meaning, that the people who used them understood without needing to articulate it. The candle is worth pausing on. Light in the medieval world was not the taken-for-granted, switched-on and off convenience it is in the modern world. It was a produced thing, the result of labour. The labour of the chandler who made the candles, the labour of whoever had procured them, the small act of will involved in lighting them and maintaining them. A candle in a prison cell on a condemned person's last night was a choice. Someone had decided that this person, in this situation, deserved light. In a world where light was not free or automatic, this was not nothing. And candles also burned down. They were, by their nature, a demonstration of time passing. Each reduction of the candle's length was a visible measurement of the night's progress, a physical fact that could be seen and understood without any additional apparatus. The condemned person who watched a candle burn down through the night was watching, literally, the passage of time in a form that made it concrete and undeniable. Whether this was comforting or agonizing is an individual question, but it was, in any case, an experience that was built into the material conditions of the night in a way that says, from this distance, meaningful. The bread that was provided, the food of the final night, had its own layers of significance. Bread in the medieval world was not simply nutrition. It was the staff of life, the primary food, the thing without which nothing else was adequate. To give someone bread was to acknowledge their membership in the community of the living. To give bread to a condemned person on their last night was to maintain, up to the last possible moment, the material expression of their humanity. They were still a person who ate, who needed food, who was sustained by the ordinary provisions of earthly life. The bread also inevitably carried Eucharistic resonances in a culture where the Eucharist was the central religious act and where bread was its central material element. Whether these resonances were explicitly present in the minds of those who provided and consumed the bread of the final night is impossible to know, but the resonances were built into the culture's relationship to bread in ways that did not require explicit articulation. The sharing of bread, the feeding of the condemned, took place in a context where bread meant something beyond nutrition, and that meaning was present in the air of the cell whether or not anyone named it. The silence between the words of the night is also part of its texture. The confession and the prayer and the conversation with the confessor occupied portions of the night, but not all of it. There were hours of silence, or near silence, in which the only sounds were the ambient sounds of the building and the distant sounds of the town and the breathing of the people in the cell. Silence in the medieval world was understood differently from modern silence. The medieval tradition of contemplative prayer and mystical practice had developed a sophisticated relationship to silence as a space in which the divine presence could be encountered, in which the noise of ordinary mental activity could subside, and anything deeper could become accessible. The confessor who had been trained in this tradition, and many of those who worked with condemned prisoners came from religious orders that valued contemplative practice, brought this understanding of silence to the cell. The silence of the night was not empty. It was charged with presence, with attention, with the weight of the situation and the potential of the spiritual moment. The condemned person who had reached the point where words were no longer necessary, who sat in silence with the confessor through the small hours, was not necessarily in a worse condition than the condemned persons who were still talking and praying aloud. They might be in a better one. There is a kind of threshold in extreme human experience where the tools that have been useful up to a point, words, prayers, the formal structures of religious practice, no longer quite reach what needs to be reached, and where silence becomes the appropriate response. The great contemplative traditions of all cultures have described this threshold and the accounts of those who accompanied condemned prisoners to their deaths suggest that this threshold was sometimes reached in the small hours of the final night, and that those who had the eyes to see it recognized what they were witnessing. The confessor who had reached this place with a condemned person, who sat with them in the silence of the small hours, and felt, as he sometimes described in his accounts, that the ordinary distinctions between his own condition and the condemned persons had somehow dissolved. This confessor was having an experience that was not exactly the experience of the condemned person, but that was also not entirely separate from it. Two human beings in a small stone room at the edge of a night that was the edge of a life, occupying a common silence that held all the words and prayers and fears of the preceding hours. This is perhaps as close as the historical record allows us to come to what the night before a medieval execution really was. Not a procedure, though it had the form of one. Not a ritual, though it followed ritual patterns. Not a performance, though it had a public dimension. It was a human situation, extreme, specific, organized by institutional forces but inhabited by individuals, in which people did their best with what they had, in service of something that they understood as larger than themselves and larger than the occasion, in the dark and cold of a night that was both ordinary and singular, both historical and timeless. The morning that followed was irrevocable, but the night that preceded it was filled with something that irrevocability alone does not define, something that the people who lived through it carried forward in their memories, something that the institutional records that documented it encode without quite capturing. Something human, something that mattered, something that, across all the centuries and all the silence, still just barely reaches us, if we're quiet enough and slow enough and willing enough to let it. Let the night have the last word now. Let it be simply what it was, dark and cold and long and attended and finally quietly over. In the documents that survive from the confraternities of late medieval Italy, documents that are housed now in various Florentine archives and that scholars have been working through for well over a century without exhausting their content, there appear occasionally small anomalies in the standard format of the execution records. These are moments where the brother writing up the account departs from the formal template that the confraternity's record-keeping required and adds something personal, something that the template did not request, but that the writer apparently felt compelled to include. One such anomaly, noted by the historian Samuel Cohn in his study of the Florentine confraternities, involves a condemned man of whom almost nothing is known. Not his name, not his crime, not the year of his execution, because that part of the record is damaged. What's of is the account of his final night, written by the brother who accompanied him. And what is anomalous about it is a single sentence near the end, added in different ink from the rest of the account, apparently written later than the main text. The sentence says, approximately translated, "He asked me at the end if I was afraid. I said I was not. He said he was not afraid either. I do not know if that was true. I do not know if it was true for me." That sentence, added in different ink, presumably some time after the execution when the brother returned to his account with something that had stayed with him, that sentence is the most complete picture of the final night that the historical record contains. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is honest. Because it captures the uncertainty, the limitation of anyone's ability to know what another person is feeling, or whether their words match their interior reality. the particular intimacy of two people in the dark sharing an uncertainty about something that would not admit of a comfortable answer. Were they afraid? Was the dying man telling the truth when he said he was not? Was the brother? We cannot know, and neither could they, fully. What we can know is that they asked the question, that they tried to answer it honestly, that the uncertainty was shared and acknowledged rather than covered by any more comfortable formulation, and that the brother, afterwards, could not let it go, could not simply record the standard outcome and move on, but had to return and add in different ink the thing that had stayed with him. That is the night before a medieval execution in its most essential form. Not the theology, not the institutional framework, not the ritual structure, though all of those were real and important, but this. Two human beings in a cell, asking each other if they were afraid, answering imperfectly, and one of them surviving to write it down in a different ink later when he understood that it mattered. It matters, even now, even here, in the quiet dark of a night that is very far from any scaffold, very far from any stone cell, very far from the 14th century, and the bells and the candles and the cold. The question asked in that cell is still a real question. The uncertainty in the answer is still a real uncertainty. The act of writing it down afterwards is different ink because it stayed. That act of bearing witness to a moment that the standard record wouldn't contain, that is as human as anything in the historical record, and it is here with us now as we let the night do what it does and carry us forward gently to whatever comes next, sleep. The night is over, or nearly. The dark is full of rest, not fear. Let it take you where it will. There's one more thing worth knowing about the night before a medieval execution, and it is a thing that the institutional records do not quite capture, but that the anthropological evidence for medieval culture strongly suggests was present. It is the thing that was not said. Every conversation has what is not said in it as well as what is said. Every confession includes the things that are not confessed, not necessarily from dishonesty, but from the limits of the language, from the difficulty of translating interior experience into words, from the particular kinds of silence that surround the most extreme and most private aspects of a person's inner life. The confessor who sat through the long night with the condemned person was hearing what the condemned person could say, and was also, in some measure, present with what they could not say. What cannot be said at the edge of death is perhaps the most essential thing. It is the thing that all the prayers and rituals and institutional structures were organized around in some sense. The thing that the forms of confession and absolution were trying to reach, not always successfully. It is the specific quality of a specific person's existence, the irreducible particularity of their interior life, the things that made them who they were in ways that no confession could fully articulate. The condemned person in the cell was not only their sins, not only their crimes, not only their spiritual condition. They were a person with a particular history, a particular set of memories, particular things they loved and hated and feared and hoped for, a particular relationship to the world that was about to end. None of this was directly accessible to the confessor or to anyone else in the cell. It was present. It was in the most fundamental sense the condemned person, but it was not communicable in any direct way. What the confessor could do, and what the best confessors apparently did, was to be present with this inaccessible interior in a way that acknowledged its reality without requiring its full communication. to sit with someone and to know that you do not know them fully, but to maintain your full attention and full care toward them regardless. This is perhaps the deepest thing the pastoral tradition of the accompaniment of the condemned was trying to practice. Not knowledge of the other person, but presence with the other person's unknowability. Not the solution to their fear or their grief or their guilt, but the willingness to stay with them while they inhabited those things without resolution. The night before a medieval execution, understood at this level, was a practice of human presence in the face of the ultimately unresolvable. Death does not resolve. It ends. These are not the same thing. The condemned person's fear, if they had it, did not resolve in the night before their execution. It was not argued away or prayed away. The grief of separation from their family, if they felt it, did not resolve. The question of what happened to their soul, which was the explicit subject of the night's spiritual work, did not really resolve either, because the theology that organized the night also insisted, at its foundations, that the final disposition of any particular soul was known only to God and not to any human confessor, however skilled and however sincere. What resolved, if anything resolved, was something smaller and more practical. The condemned person arrived at a relationship to their situation that allowed them to function within it, to do what needed to be done to face the morning. Whether that relationship was peace or acceptance or mere exhaustion or something else, it was enough to walk to the scaffold. The night had produced that minimum, and sometimes more than that minimum, but always at least that. And the night ended, as all nights end, as this one, wherever you're receiving it, will also end. The darkness gives way. The silence makes room for the first sounds of morning. The specific particularity of the night fades into the general condition of a new day. The things that felt enormous in the dark are sometimes revealed to be the same size they always were, and sometimes they retain their enormity, but in the light they are at least visible, at least nameable, at least possible to look at directly. The night before, a medieval execution ended in exactly this way. The dark gave way. The silence made room. The condemned person, however they had spent the night, was brought into the light of a morning that they would not survive, and the people who had spent the night with them, the confessor, the confraternity brothers, the guards, stepped with them into that light, each carrying their portion of the night forward. We carry it forward, too, in a different way, across a much greater distance. We carry the fact of it, the fact that these nights happened, that these people sat in those cells, that this work was done with this degree of seriousness and this degree of care. We carry it as evidence of what human beings are capable of, in the extremity and in the ordinary, when they take seriously the proposition that every person's final hours matter, that the work of presence and care is worth doing fully regardless of the circumstances, that the dark is better inhabited together than alone. That proposition is not medieval, it is not modern, it is simply human, as persistent as the dark itself, as present as the quiet that surrounds you now. Rest. The night is yours. The morning will come in its own time, and the bells, wherever they ring, ring for everyone.